Space, the final frontier. It's been 3 months since I made a space video, and last time I really only talked about a few words, and learning about the days of the week led me to the 7 heavenly bodies. So, we're going to go through those 7 heavenly bodies. But first, I want to clear some things up. That last video was my most viewed video of all time, finally topping my first ever video. And that blew my mind. There are a lot of new faces in the crowd. About 24 of you at the time of recording. Thank you all, newbies and OG word nerds alike. On that note, I'd like to address some things that were untrue that I said in the last video. One being that Samstag means Saturn's Day. Someone on Reddit brought it up to me and showed me that it actually comes from the word Sabbath, which makes sense because Saturday was the Sabbath. Also, I'd like to clear up that I said that the English pattern was different and not related to the Greek pattern. It is, and I'm going to address that later. But hey, the names of the planets are interesting themselves, right? Sure, they're named after gods, but that only touches the tip of the iceberg. You see, the Greeks are the ones who started that idea of the gods being associated with the planets, and then other cultures copied that. The Babylonians, the Romans, and eventually from the Romans, we copied it. And what's even more interesting to me is the original names of the planets in Greek.
I got a little bit overzealous with this project.
Mercury was called Stilbon, and that meant gleamer in Greek. Venus was called Phosphoros, which means light bringer, and that's related to the chemical name phosphorus. Mars was called Pyroeus, which means fiery, because it's visibly red. Jupiter was called Phaethon, which means bright, and Saturn was called Phaenon, which means shiner. And then, after they had all those names for the specific planets in the night sky, and then they gave each planet to a god, according to its, properties. And some of those are pretty clear to me, like Venus being the brightest and most beautiful planet would be given to Venus. So I guess I should say Phosphoros to Aphrodite, and Pyroeus, Mars, is fiery, and fire is mean and aggressive, and that goes to Ares, the god of war, and the other ones are kind of abstract. So Mercury was given to the god of wisdom, which was Hermes. And Jupiter was given to the king of the gods, which is Zeus. And then Saturn was given to the father of the king of the gods, the most distant planet for the oldest god. And that was Kronos, Kronos with a K, not with a CH. So then, the Romans did that, right? And that's how we have our modern planet names, and we can see how that lines up with the Greek. But, and when it came to Germanic languages, and this is something that was talked about on Reddit too, the connection between Germanic gods and Roman gods is harder to see because Germanic cultures were Christianized differently than Latin cultures in such a way that it's hard to tell what their original gods and original mythologies were like in some ways, if that makes sense. So when you get to the pattern that the Greek follows, right? It makes sense, and I said it made sense with Ares and Tu because they're both gods of war. And then you get Odin on Wednesday. Now, Odin was the god of wisdom, as well as being the top god. So I guess that Odin was more associated with wisdom than being like the king, so they gave him Mercury. And then Thor then became Jupiter for Thursday. I guess he was the king of the gods then, or the next best thing, I'm assuming. I have a feeling that, because of all those Mjolnir necklaces, that Thor was more of a people's god than Odin. Like, a lot of the stories I've read from Greek, Norse mythology, Odin's more of like a wise old man or a trickster or even a shapeshifter at times. And Thor is like the kick your butt, knock a dwarf into a flaming pyre and all that stuff. So I guess that he's more of a king of the gods type thing. And I know I'm getting into something that's like way out of my field of study, but I think it's definitely applicable to understanding what these words are. And Freya being with Venus, or Frigg being with Venus, makes sense too, because she was a goddess of love. And then excluding any of the Norse gods for Saturn makes sense too, because they already established that the king of the gods was Thor and that his father would be that, but his father is already Odin, who's Mercury. So they decided to just leave that as the Roman. Now let's get into the names of the planets themselves from the Roman, right? And how we know them today. Those words will have etymologies too, right? We already had a video about names, and we know that a lot of names have etymologies. Why wouldn't the names of gods have etymologies? So let's start with the moon and the sun, because the Germanic peoples already had words for those things, obviously, because who wouldn't have a word for the sun? So the sun comes from Old English sunna, which is from the Proto-Germanic sunno, which is from the Proto-Indo-European sol, which is related to all the other words for sun, like solar and helio. Pretty much all of the Indo-European languages kept the same word for that, because why would you make a different word for the sun? You don't have to reinvent the wheel. The moon comes from Old English mona, which is from Proto-Germanic menon, which comes from a Proto-Indo-European word. And there are lots of Proto-Indo-European words, but I've decided to make the moon the Proto-Indo-European word web. So here you can see, for the first time ever, I'm including 2 Proto-Indo-European roots, because even in Proto-Indo-European, words beget more words. From the Proto-Indo-European me, which meant to measure, they got the Proto-Indo-European word mens, which meant the moon. You see, the moon is a great way to measure time. It's different every night, and it repeats a cycle on a normal pattern, which makes it really good for counting days, months, etc. The Proto-Indo-European me led to the Proto-Germanic word mela, which meant like a measure of time, like a measure, like as in an amount of time, which led to our word meal. And me in Proto-Indo-European also led to materi in Latin, which gave us the words meter and measure. So then from the mens word, it led to the Proto-Germanic meno and menoths. If you see that symbol, the symbol right there, it goes th. It does not go b. But that aside, those 2 words became moon and month. You can see the th is still in month. And then in the Latin, from the Proto-Indo-European word for moon, mens, they had mensis and menstruum. So mensis meant month and menstruum meant monthly. And that could be a monthly payment, it could be a monthly office or occurrence. And that led to our word menstrual. And I don't think I have to explain that to you. Mercury is from the Latin mercurius, which is from another Latin word merx, which means merchandise. It's related to the word merchandise, obviously, as well as the word march and merchant. This is because Mercury was the god of speed and salesmanship, among other things. So it makes sense that these words would be related to his name because that's what he was associated with. Venus was a Latin word that meant love, desire, or a beautiful object. And that came from the Proto-Indo-European root wen, which also meant desire. So it's easy to see how a goddess of love and beauty would be associated with the word desire. Mars is tricky. The oldest form of that god's name that we have is Mavors, and that's from, I believe, pre-Italic, which is like Proto-Latin. This is just an old name for him, Mavors. We don't know how that name came to be, and that's not necessarily because it doesn't exist. It could just not have been recorded, or all the other words that it's related to are not being used anymore, or something else like that. So while we don't know the etymology for that word in depth that gives us like a meaning for the word, it doesn't mean it doesn't exist. Jupiter comes from Proto-Indo-European Diu Pater, God, Father, Father, God. The character of Jupiter exists in many Indo-European pantheons. Zeus, his name derives from the Diu, and Dio, the Spanish word, comes from the same root, meaning God. That's pretty interesting, I think. God, Father God. I mean, it's just descriptive of who he is. Saturn is in the same boat as Mars. We know that he is the Italic god of agriculture, so that's pretty. It's pretty straightforward, like who he is. There used to be a theory that it was a past participle of the Latin verb for to sow, which happened to be satis, but the problem with that is the name Saturn is older than that word, so it can't have descended from that, obviously. So just like Mars, we don't know where it came from, and that doesn't mean that there's no etymology, that just means we don't know what it is. Now, someone complained in my last space video that I didn't talk about the etymology of the word space. So I'm going to tell you about the etymology of the word space. The Old French spasa, which is from the Latin spatium, which is from Proto-Indo-European spe. Riveting. Spe means to spread, and that's related to the word spatula. I think it's interesting that we think of space as a new frontier, but we're using words, some of which are so old, we don't even know where they came from. Thank you for watching, Word Nerd. Be sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and I'll see you next Monday. Bye-bye.